Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Thriving Adoptees podcast. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by David. David, looking forward to this conversation, David. Really.
Me too. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, David and I had a chat like a couple of months ago to get to know one another and talk about what we might talk about. Towards the end of the conversation, David, you talked about stepping back from our beliefs, and this kind of it seemed very related to the title of your book, right? Your memoir, which is Blind in One Eye, if I remember.
That's right.
And so, why is this stepping back from our beliefs important, do you think?
Well, you may remember that the tagline beneath the title of my book, Blind in One Eye, is that it's a story about seeing the possibilities. And I feel like my adoption story, where I learned a lot more than I knew about my adoption when I turned 40, opened my blind eye to the fact that I had been going for 40 years on a certain set of beliefs about my adoption that proved to be, if not entirely false, far from the truth. And I applied that thinking to my life and realized, I looked back on a lot of the decisions that I had made based on whatever beliefs I had at the moment. And those beliefs, because I had them so firmly, kept me from seeing alternatives, from seeing better choices. So that's what I mean about stepping back from your beliefs. It's always good, in my opinion, to challenge the core beliefs that you have, whether it's religious beliefs or work ethic or anything like that, or in my case, the easiest one, about who I was as an adoptee, where I had come from, was what led me to, I think for the last 28 years, be a slightly different person who is much more open to going left rather than right when I thought right was the correct direction to go.
Yeah.
Make any sense?
Yeah, I think so. And I was thinking about my next question, and it seems really apposite. I think it seems very relevant given what you just said. So I'm re-listening to a book by a neuroscientist called Chris Niebauer, who talks about the left and the right brain. And the left brain is our meaning maker. And it's the part within us that wants to be right all the time. And the right-hand brain is our more creative, open side that's open to new possibilities. And we're not born with these. Well, so the left brain is what keeps us from change. It's what keeps us closed, what keeps us certain and set in our ways, right? So I don't know if we have this thing is this is a thing over in the States, but there's a lot of talk about grumpy old men.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
and I'm trying desperately not to be one of those.
Well, that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to you're going against the tide. You're looking to stay open, and me too, right? And yet I see a lot of people that I know becoming more set in their ways and becoming more grumpier old men, and they're kind of like they're shutting down rather than opening up.
Right.
But
I mean, I love change, and if you love change and are curious, you will always be looking at a new way of doing things, in my opinion. Yeah. And that's, to me, the fun part. I mean, that's why at age 68 I became a pilot. Not an easy task for a 30-year-old, a much more challenging opportunity for a 68-year-old. But there you go. I mean, let's give it a shot. And I'll tell you that most of my friends, my age or older, look at me as if, why in the world would you do that? And that's the grumpy old men, I think,
Yeah.
and women.
Yeah. So what you learnt when you're what you learnt in your the adopted segment of your life, or the adopted segment of your story, became like a springboard for a bigger opening up.
True. I mean, when I so until I was 40 years old, I understood that I was the child of two married people who had a son 7 years older than me, who was in ill health. And when I came along, they couldn't afford to keep me, so they gave me up. That's the story that I carried until I was 40. And it was a story that propelled me not so much to meet my birth parents. I don't know why I never had a particularly strong interest in that, but I had a very strong interest in meeting this brother who was 7 years older than I was. I grew up as an only child. And as any kid would, when you're moving along and you're unsure of yourself, you sort of have this idea that, wow, if I'd had this brother in my life, he would have been magical. You know, that's the way you sort of carry these things. He would have been this unbelievable character who would have helped me through whatever, you know, childhood trial I was going through. And so over the years, it became more of a passion for me to try to find this brother. And as I got older, it was how to try to find this guy before he's not alive anymore. And that process, and this was in the pre-internet, you know, 80s and 90s. That story, that fable, that belief in this 7-year older brother, is what caused me to start looking for my family. And obviously, my birth family, if you start looking for a birth family, you ultimately are really looking for your birth mother. She's the only reliable link in the story. And so that set in process, a very slow process back in those days, of learning things. It eventually caused me to find out that I was, I mean, I hate to sell the whole story, but on a few days before my 40th birthday, I learned that I was one of 7 children, all full brothers and sisters, all born to the same mother and father. And the parents, my birth parents, still very much alive, still very much married, still very much pretending to lead a classic middle class life. I went in one day from being an only child to one of 7. The process of meeting all of those 6 siblings took some time. And eventually I was able to meet my birth mother. One of the great stains on my parents is that my birth parents is that my birth father, even after we'd all reappeared, we were not a risk to him. He still refused to acknowledge we existed. It's always a terrible thing to realize that your birth father is a coward, which is how I saw it. But the story that I had been told was a slight truth rather than the whole truth. Yes, in fact, I did have a brother who was 7 years older than me. Yes, my parents were married. So that was the end of the story that was told to me. What no one was told was that between my brother and me, my birth parents had given up 3 girls in a row. We were mostly born about 13 months apart. All 4 of us had been given up in secret, so much so that not my older brother and then my 2 youngest sisters, who were raised by my birth parents, never knew about us. They learned about us when we reappeared. My birth parents, had spent a life hiding from us. They had never owned a home. They rented always. They never had credit cards because they never wanted a credit history. They never wanted to leave a trace. So they lived this seemingly middle-class life with 3 children, hiding from us, the 4 of us. A very different story than what I was told when I could first understand what adoption meant.
Yeah. So what was driving that pretense, you think?
Sadly, a few things. The most superficial of them was that my birth parents were both from a historic lineage in the United States. My birth mother was, as I am, a direct descendant of a relatively famous family, a former governor of our state, a general in the Civil War. There's a county named after her maiden name. She was extremely proud of her historic legacy. My birth father's family was similarly from a very old Revolutionary War family. And so she would say to people later that she was doing everything to protect her family's legacy. Okay, I'll buy that to a certain extent. But the real fact is that I think both of my parents, birth parents, were alcoholics. And my birth mother was largely undiagnosed, but eventually found to be bipolar. So they led a life that my three siblings who grew up with them have at various times said to us. Well, they've said something, one version or another of you, that is the adoptees, were the lucky ones. My youngest sister tells a story that when she was in grade school, she was a sort of in the US, we call them latchkey kids. She would have gone home alone from school because my parents were working, my birth parents were working. She was instructed as a child that she was to come home, lock the door, and if anyone knocked on the door, that she should ignore it. And only later did her mother, my birth mother, admit to her that it was because she was afraid that it would be one of us at the door. It would be a pretty hard house to live in with that kind of thing hanging over their lives. And I've heard many stories along those lines.
Yeah. So it's fear and shame and
right. Remember, this is the 50s and 60s, and back then, still there were no open adoptions. It was the stigma of giving children up for adoption, and I suspect even more so when you think about the oddity of having 7 children and giving 4 of them up in a row in secret. That's a bit heavy icing on the cake.
Yeah, but the 4 kids, that was just a reflection of a bigger feeling of shame and stigma and fear.
I think so. Yeah, I mean, my birth father was described as a very serious man. He was a mathematician and engineer. He was, by all accounts, a very smart man, very quiet man. He apparently just lived in the shame, the 1950s and 60s shame of a man who was incapable of keeping a family, having children he was not going to keep.
Yeah,
I mean, I guess I can understand it. I mean, I try to be sympathetic. I'm sure it was the pressure was enormous as a working man in 50s and 60s US, carrying a secret around like that and having if they were unstable, they were, the one thing they could have done is not have children, right? But they were unstable enough to keep when they presumably had the means not to, having children that they had no intention of keeping.
Yeah.
It's not for me to understand. I mean, I can guess, but I can't understand.
Yeah, it's just a part of the, is it them not living up, if they've got this historic lineage, as you say, and especially in those days, male breadwinner stuff, stereotypes, but very much in force then, and he didn't live up. So he was, maybe was he not living up career-wise to what to his lineage, and he was letting everybody down, and it's just like cycling down. And it seems a part of the shame story rather than the stuff in its entirety. So how did this how did this discovery of the truth, how did that impact you and your?
At first, of course, it was fantastic. I mean, it was I'd set out with a goal only to meet a brother, and in fact, I mean, the day I found out about it was Mother's Day of that year. I came home from something we were doing on Mother's Day, and my wife had gone up to grocery shop or whatever, and this was in the days when you still had an answering machine. I saw that the answering machine was blinking, and I listened to it, and it was the voice of a woman I did not know. She told me her name. She told me she was in Ohio and that she had something confidential to discuss with me about, and then she said my birth mother's name. And at this point, no person other than my wife and a private investigator would have known her name to say it to me. And by this time, I had had several phone calls with my birth mother that were shocking. She was extraordinarily mean. She denied that I was her child in the first call or two. And I think this is the the bipolar disorder or whatever showing, was just vicious, and then would leave vicious voicemails to me, threatening me to call the police and do all sorts of things. And then eventually, presumably on the other side of the spectrum, I received a phone call from her where she admitted that she was my mother, told me that she had 2 other children by that time. I knew that they didn't know anything, and that my appearance would be a disaster. So I basically said, okay, I'll leave you alone. If you ever want to talk to me again, let's talk. So that was really the last I'd heard until I received this voicemail message. And to be honest with you, because I am a lawyer, my first instinct was, she's hired a lawyer who's calling me to tell me to leave her alone when I'm not even bothering her. So it was one of those kinds of. So I did pick up the phone. I called this person. She answers the phone and she asked me almost instantly, "Do you know who I am?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Do you know who Emily Brown is?" Sorry, I shouldn't say the name. Yes. And she then started to pour out the story that she and her 2 other sisters were my sisters. We had all been given up for adoption, and that they had been looking for me for 20 years because one way or another, they'd all been ahead of me in finding my birth mother. And this woman apparently had enough of a relationship with my birth mother that she called her on Mother's Day. And my birth mother started making elliptical references to the fact that I had called. So she stayed on the call long enough to get information and immediately called me. So in that call, which lasted for several hours, that's the day I went from being an only child with a known older brother somewhere out there to a substantial family. The 4 of us almost immediately got together at my home, flew in from wherever to meet. It was a remarkable experience. And then over time, we got to meet the other siblings because they finally found out what was going on. They expressed great shame, sorrow that they hadn't known us for all of these years. And it was, I think, one of those rare, great reunion stories. Eventually, I had a chance to spend a few hours in person with my birth mother, and she came to, from time to time, calling me and leaving voicemail messages that she loved me. So it was it's one of those happy stories. Again, I never got to meet my birth father, even though he was alive long after we were all together. But it was a great thing. I now have, as most siblings would in a big family, relationships of different sorts with my siblings. But it has been a spectacular, enriching experience for me, and has very much colored my life. And it led me to write a book that talks about seeing the possibilities. I mean, right up into the moment of that phone call, I would not have even been able to speculate that there were others, that there were other people people looking for me. My sisters berated me over time about why I never went to this organization or that organization, where they would have put all of this. If you're looking for us, if you're the child of, here we are. I never knew to do any of that. It never occurred to me. Today, of course, on the internet, or 23andMe or whatever else, we know in 4 minutes. But it was those kinds of chances that, because I was not looking for them, because I was not even imagining them, I never took the steps to create the universe that took until I was 40 to be a part of.
Yeah. I've heard this from a few different people, is that, and a mass generalization is that men look less, men question less.
I suspect that's right.
Like adoptees.
I mean, my sisters were all classic. About the time they started thinking about having children, they wanted to know what the time bombs were, right? So that drove them to it. I'm an idiot boy. What do I know? I'm not thinking about any of those things. And to be honest, I did not. I mean, yes, I thought about my brother, but I didn't dwell on it. I mean, from random times, I would get sort of a bug in my ear, and I would write off to the state of Virginia, the Commonwealth of Virginia, which is a very hostile state to information for adoptees, and would get my file, which would have been literally had words cut out of the pages to make sure that there's no identification. And today I can't get my original birth certificate, even though I know better what it would say on it than the clerk does. I know exactly whose names are on it, but they still deny that there's another birth certificate out there that actually identifies my family. So I would have done all of those things, but literally the only reason I really got serious about it was that a very close friend of my wife was riding on the DC Metro, the subway in the city. And she came into the office. She was a coworker of my wife, and she came in one day and said, I didn't know David had a brother. And my wife said, what? She knew I did have a brother, but not one that anybody would know about. She says, why? And says, well, there was this guy sitting across from me on the Metro who looked exactly like David, only maybe 5 years older or so, just older. And I was too shy, but I was going to say, are you David Ford's brother? But I didn't. And so my wife calls me, and I said, well, find out what metros, where were they on the Metro? What was going on? And I was working in my law firm down in DC, and I remember, she called me to the office. I remember looking out the window, high-rise building, looking down at the street and thinking, what if that guy is in fact my brother, and he's somewhere, he was on the street, he's out there somewhere. If I don't look for him now, and I wait another 20 years, and I find out that he did work in Washington, he worked around the block, and he's dead, how would I feel about it? So literally, it was just something silly like that finally said to me, okay, enough, let's figure this out. The other piece of it was, again, remember in the pre-internet days, I was working in a law firm, so I had a lot of partners walking down the hallways, and I was talking to one guy one day, and he said, hey, by the way, if you ever need a private investigator, we had this unbelievable guy work on a case that we were doing. And it's sort of, why in the world would this guy tell me that? And then it's sort of like, yeah, I actually could use a private investigator. So he gave me the information, and that started it all going. I mean, I went the classic old, let's find a private investigator. That guy said to me, first time I talked, he said, oh, this is just a missing person case. Basically, we just got to find your mother. She's the only one that knows the truth. That story about being married is probably nonsense. So we got to find her. And he said, it's either going to happen real fast or it's going to take a long time. And he ended up being right about it. It took a long time. But it did happen. It did cause me eventually to make contact with my birth mother. And beyond that, everything started to fall into place. Again, very differently than I expected, but grateful for the way it did turn out.
Yeah. So just taking you a step back a bit, your mother, obviously this birth mother, obviously with this bipolar stuff, and one called denying it, and then another called being vicious, and then calls out admitting to it. and saying that she loved you. How did you deal with that? Did you spot that was something amiss, or did that kind of denial have did it land heavy with you, or what was?
It did. So the private investigator had found her, and unknown to me, he had talked to her through one of his colleagues. She had made the denial, but the surprising thing was, I did not know that they had given her my contact information, my phone number at my office, my phone number at home. And so by the time I spoke to her, it was again, I was a lawyer in a law firm. I'd gone out to lunch. I came back from lunch, and the receptionist on the floor came running at me and said, thank God you're here. There's a terrible person who has left 6 messages for you. I can't take any more of this. She calls and is just screaming. So I get a pink slip like you used to in the old days in the messages, and it said her name at the top of it, call back. And I had no idea what was going on. I mean, I knew the investigator was working on it. Tried to reach him. He wasn't available. So she called again, and I took the call. And it was just unbelievable abuse and just violence. Who do I think I am? I'm, so on. Threatening to call the police. And I'd said to her, okay, well, apparently we've made a mistake. I knew we hadn't. The details were clear. And I'll never call you again. You'll never hear from me again. But if you'd ever like to talk, I'm available just in case, you'd like to talk. She, hung up the phone, and honestly, I thought that was it. I was disappointed. I was probably a little devastated. I mean, who really wants to be abused in that way by somebody you absolutely know is your birth mother? So it was probably more a visceral reaction to that to start with. But I had some satisfaction. I mean, I knew enough now that eventually I could get to that brother if I wanted to. I had closed the loop. I knew what I needed to know. There was not a mystery left. I could easily find this guy if I wanted to. Turns out he was clearly not the guy who was on the metro. If you saw us together, you would say, "Yeah, they look like brothers," but you would never have said on the subway, "That's David Ford's doppelganger." It never would have happened. So I felt some satisfaction that I had resolved it, but of course, who wouldn't be unhappy with how that had ended? And then when she started, I was on a business trip, and my wife called me and said, I got home and there's this, I don't understand it, there's this terrible message from your birth mother. And when I got home that night from flying in from somewhere, Texas, I listened to it, and I just felt really sad. And I worried that I had opened a hornet's, that I'd kicked a hornet's nest. This was clearly somebody who was not stable, who, even though I said to her she would never hear from me again, was now almost stalking me. I mean, just abusive. So I began to be a bit concerned about what I had done to my wife, and I mean, she was devastated. She hadn't heard the other calls. She was listening to this thing. She was devastated for me. So I really worried about whether I had a problem that was now going to have to be resolved, and resolved unhappily. So that's the way it lasted for quite a while until this. I did get, I guess I did get another call from her, and this time she was, I was around, so I could take the phone call, and she sounded like a totally different person. She sounded half asleep. Said she'd had a terrible migraine. She asked me questions as if she didn't know who I was and why I had called her. So we went through, I tried to be as kind as I could, sort of like forgetting the fact that she had just reaped days worth of abuse on me. And at the end of that, she acknowledged who she was. She told me that she had 3 children, and that it would just be devastating to upset their lives and do those sorts of things. And I really, at that point, I felt, okay, this is all right. She was a little more motherly, not terribly, but a little more motherly than she'd been in the last calls. And I had sort of a resolution of it. I mean, I had closure. I knew that at some point when she wasn't alive, I'd reach out to those people or not. I mean, I wasn't really terribly worried about it, but it was a good solution to the problem. I no longer felt particularly afraid, but and then there was silence. I did worry, well, am I going to now get another phone call from her? It's the other person. It never happened. I mean, really, the next sequence was her admitting to one of my other adopted siblings that we all existed, and there I was. And then, the story is a completely different story, and becomes a phenomenally positive experience, which I acknowledge is not typical of adoptees finding families.
Yeah, it's mixed. You're getting a different reaction. You said, as you said, you've got a different sort of relationship with each of one of your siblings, and obviously, and a different relationship again with your birth mother, and a different relationship again from the birth father. So it's like it's a very mixed bag, isn't it? I guess one of
but I mean, it's human, right? It's just human. You have to accept humans where they are, and that's the other thing that I think as part of the seeing the possibilities is I probably in my early life and young lawyerhood, I was pretty much of a perfectionist. I probably put people to pretty high standards and found a lot of them failing, right? And I do believe that while as you get older, you accept that you have to work with people as they are. I do think that this accelerated that because I really got thrown into a mix of people with whom I was going to have a family relationship, with whom I had never had a family relationship. We were all trying to discover our strengths and weaknesses. There were challenges. My brother and I had a very rocky relationship. Do not anymore. We have a good relationship, but we had a rocky relationship. And, every one of my siblings came from a different place. And it was enjoyable trying to figure that out. We had no common denominator, I mean, other than genetics. Life experience, growing up, everything. My next older sister is kind of a type A like I am, and we have a great relationship. I have a feeling that if we'd grown up together, we might not have a good relationship because we might have, as teenagers and young adults, might have had pretty sharp elbows for each other. So I probably am a beneficiary of, in many ways, of starting these relationships when we're all settled in and able to address each other in a different way.
Were you tough on yourself as you were tough on others in terms of the perfection?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, pretty much a terrible perfectionist. Terrible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how's that these days?
Oh, much better. It's age, I guess, but I do. My flight instructors, as I told you, I got a pilot's license. They would regularly say to me, "You are being too tough on yourself." So I may not have completely escaped it, but I do make a lot more allowances for myself as well as the allowances I try to make for others.
Yeah, yeah. I
try. It's hard work, right? Yeah.
It is. Yeah, I call myself a recovering control freak.
Yeah.
But it's not everybody is used to that, though. Do you know what I mean? People expect me to be a certain way, and I'm not, and that kind of that freaks some people out a little bit.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, the grumpy old men want things to stay exactly the way they are, right? So
yeah,
they want Simon to be just the way Simon's always been, because they fit you into their puzzle in a particular slot.
Yeah. It sounds to me that you talked about talked about that emotion, a higher level of a growth of your emotional intelligence on the back of these life-changing events last time. I think one of the things that pops into my head is a conversation with another adoptee I don't know how long ago, it's a couple of months. I'm not sure which one unfortunately, I can't remember which one it was. But this was an adoptee who was also a therapist, and a lot of therapists get involved. A lot of adoptees call therapists in that reunion phase, right? So either before it, or to be prepared, or during it, because it's bringing up stuff for them that they're struggling with, and that wasn't my experience. So
nor mine.
It was. I didn't do that. I did some therapy led me to restart the search. The search was on hold when I went to see a therapist. So, but what this therapist said, which I think is very important for me to just explain to the listeners in case they fall into that category, is that as adoptees, there's a likelihood we've done some work on ourselves, and before reunion. However, that isn't the same for our birth parents, right? So the likelihood is that they haven't, or they are less likely to have done any work on themselves, and therefore they are less likely to have moved on. So we're expecting them to have changed, and they haven't. Some of them are frozen in time. The trauma's been so bad for them. So what I'm getting around to saying is to hold our expectations about our birth parents whilst we're in that search, or whilst we're in that early stage. We've got to hold these expectations lightly, because they might not have. It might be really still sticking for them. It might be a real sticking point.
No question. I mean, even ignoring the speculated mental health issues that I ascribed to my birth mother, she and her husband had been, at that point, in my case, managing this internally for 40 years. 40 years. They had been hiding secrets for 40 years, not only from the world, but from their children, from their families, their parents, everybody in their system. Nobody knew about this. Imagine the weight. And if you do that for 40 years, how stuck, I mean, just think about how emotionally stuck you are when there's, not to make it sound like we're every thought in their heads, but they clearly structured their lives so they were not far away from thinking about this issue every day. And I'd pop in and expect them to embrace me. Under what circumstances would that have been a high probability? And clearly, knowing what I know about my birth parents, therapy was as far away from their thinking as could be. Not that, probably for most of that time, therapy wasn't a big deal anyway. But so I did not. I was very unhappy. I didn't like the way I was treated when I met my birth mother, but I didn't hold it. I know that these were, now I know that these were very fragile people. So I do try to be, even today, sympathetic. I mean, I wish I could have made my introduction to my birth mother less traumatic for her, not for me, but for her. Clearly, it was a terrible, terrible day when my private investigator told me I'd found her. Yeah. I can only imagine how she felt. after all those years.
And yet, however carefully that person had trod, it would probably have the same outcome, right?
No, absolutely, absolutely. Now, am I so noble a character that if I could rewind the tapes knowing what I know, would I leave her alone? No. So, there's some, all right, you're gonna have to live with it, Mom. It's just the way it is. I wouldn't spare her the traumatic experience simply because of that. Just,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but no, I would still want to have gone through the process, needed to go through the process. But I am sympathetic.
Yeah. Sure. Sorry, I'm waffling. Struggling for words. I'm trying to think of the person's name, and it's not coming to mind. But I did an interview with a Canadian birth mother a couple of years ago, so in the early days of the podcast, and with a birth mother and an adoptee, and they weren't each other's mother and daughter, but she was the adoptee in Canada. She'd met her mum over a long period of time, and the lady could never. She never actually. She kind of stopped denying it, but she never actually admitted that to this to her daughter that she was a birth mother. So the minds are shutting down in all of us, we.
Well, I mean,
my birth
father is a similar example. I mean, he, to the day he died, refused to suggest that we existed, would never meet us, even though he knew that his wife was meeting with us and talking with us on a regular basis. He just would not accept any of it, even though, we, through his wife, said, all we want to do is show you that we're here, we're grateful, you gave us a life that we're happy with, it all worked out, no need for shame. He knew what we were trying to do, and he still could not acknowledge our existence.
So this takes me back, in a strange way, it takes me back to this Chris Niebauer book that I'm re-listening to at the moment. So they were having a conversation. It was an experiment, controlled experiment with a woman who had a stroke. So she was paralyzed down the left-hand side of her body. And so they did something in this experiment about, they asked this woman to point the guy running the experiment asked the woman with the paralysis to point at him, and she actually believed, she knew she was paralyzed, but she was actually arguing for the fact that she was pointing at the guy that was running the experiment. So against all this stuff, there was something in her brain told her that she was defying her paralysis and actually pointing at this guy. And it sounds incredible, but that's what this book is. This Chris Niebauer book, No Self, No Problems, it is all about. It's the I guess it's the psychology of delusion. It's absolute. Yeah. It's absolute delusion that, and that's presumably the flip side of absolute openness, right? So the tricks that the brain plays on us are incredible in their power.
Yeah, and of course, memory is a challenge too, right? I mean, we rebuild memories. We absolutely, as part of our belief system, we have clear memories of things in the past that probably aren't accurate. It's, I guess, it's part of the human condition, right? You rebuild memories to fit into your beliefs, to fit into a system that you can live with.
Yeah, it's this left brain looking to ascribe reason. It's this left brain looking to find meaning. So what some people say about this is, what the thinker thinks, the believer believes. Our left brain is it's the center of our confirmation bias. So whatever's going on, the left brain is trying to keep us locked in. So it's like, I think when you talked about fighter pilots, when you're talking about getting your pilot's license, I was thinking about Tom Cruise for some reason. But when
I can't. I'm at the opposite end of the spectrum, unfortunately, of Maverick.
But Maverick, but you are a lot taller than Tom Cruise, right? You don't have to. You don't have to have a box. You don't have to stand on a box, because he's leading ladies too. But I'm thinking when they're doing that top. Have you seen the new?
Yeah, I did, on an airplane.
So it's like it's like missile lock, right?
Yeah.
When they're doing the training, the name of the game is to get lock on the enemy, and that's when you know that if you press the button, the missile is going to lock on. It's locking onto the heat coming off the rear engine, and the however that fighter, that bogey moves, you've got missile lock, and you're going to blow him away. That's what the left-hand brain does. It is locked on, and that's why we're stuck. That's why we're stuck.
But is the right brain, aside from being creative, is it the critical thinking side? I mean, the part
it's the other way around. Yeah, it is the critical thinker. It's the devil's advocate. The right-hand brain is the devil's advocate. And I'm playing with this a little bit at the moment. So I'm jumping on the pattern interrupts. Do you know what I mean? So because the left brain is looking to say, my dad had a great one on this, growing up, that people that had hats on whilst they were driving were bad drivers. Like it was just an old man out for a run, so I'm looking for the disconnect. I'm catching myself being wrong. You know what I mean? And I'm taking rather than, because otherwise we catch, we're this confirmation bias. Because as we mentioned before, before I started recording, the reason that beliefs and holding our beliefs less important, less closely, less guardedly, is really important for me, is because one of the issues that as adoptees we struggle with is this ability that we're not good enough, right? So there's a belief, and that's behind, well, speaking for myself, that's behind my control freakism and my perfectionism.
And maybe although I've never really felt that way, maybe my perfectionism is the same result. Although I suspect I almost feel that my perfectionism is more from my environment that I grew up in than my feeling that I was somehow inferior.
Yeah. And it was avoiding mistakes. For me, I can track it back to my dad's fear as an entrepreneur, right? He was a small business owner. He was, one minute he was very, most of the time he was very creative, very right brain, very visionary guy, create a product, create a product, see if people wanted to buy it. If it didn't, just move on to the next one. That's what he was like most of the time. But there was the odd bit of doing prophet of doom stuff. I remember being on holiday once, and he said, "Oh, I wonder if I'll have a business when I get back." So there was that was going on for him. But for me, I had more of that and less of the creative stuff. I was more left brain. It's more business. I wasn't, but for me, the business I could get better at. Okay, so I could go on courses. I could read books. I could read books about emotional intelligence, for example. I could read a book about strategy. I could go on a course. I could become more empathetic. I could develop a better marketing process. It was always about being better, so the business went better. Whereas when I read the Primal Wound, and I thought, well, I'm stuck with this. I can't. There's nothing that I can do. I can't. If the Primal Wound is set in stone, which I believed it was for a while, then I'm stuck with it. I can't self-improve my way out of that. And then lo and behold, something happened, and I realized that I didn't need to buy into that primal wound, because I'm not my psychological identity. And what's wounded? I was asking myself the question. You talked about critical thinking. I was asking, well, something came to my mind. What's wounded? Okay, you've got this metaphor. Yeah, all right, you've got this metaphor, Nancy Verrier. What is wounded? And I thought, well, yeah, my feelings have been hurt for sure. Some feelings felt rejection. Yeah, but the bigger thing to me seems to be my sense of self. That's what's been hurt. Well, is my sense of self actually myself? Sense of self, another word for sense of self is ego. So yeah, my ego's been hurt, but am I my ego? No. Okay. What am I then? I'm spirit, and that spirit isn't a thing. And if it isn't a thing, it can't be wounded. So that's how my critical kind of thinking, and that's how beliefs stay true until we see otherwise, right?
Yeah.
That's all we've got to do is see that. That's all. All in inverted commas. Beliefs stay true. Your belief that you were an only child changed when it became obvious that you weren't.
Yeah. And of course, there's also the part of it is being open to all of these things, right? I mean, I could see if somebody else had their beliefs challenged. Well, this is the story I was told, and now it's not the story anymore. Would have reacted negatively to that. I mean, I like the story that I've lived with for 40 years rather than the story that I like now would have to tell, and challenge it. Be somehow adverse to it. Whereas, what you need to be, in my opinion, and what I was cool. Hey, let's see where this goes. Let's find opportunity here.
Yeah.
This is a real chance to do something. Okay, my assumptions were all wrong, or mostly wrong. So now what? Let's a new game, new set of rules. Let's play.
Yeah. Let's play. And that's the right brain. And that's why kids are more dominated by the right brain, because they're playing. Their left brain, they're the meaning maker, the inner critic, the ego, that native voice in our head hasn't developed. So
it's sort of they're able to learn new languages quickly because their left brain isn't saying to them, "You can't do that."
Indeed, yeah, and they're less concerned about making a mistake. They're open to learning new things, and they're not bothered to try it out. so when you said open language, I was just thinking about Brits, and when we Brits go abroad and to France and they don't speak English, then we shout at them. We think
that's helpful. Yeah,
they're gonna. The
French always react well to in my experience.
Volume is volume leads to understanding, and a silly example stories come into my head about me being in a restaurant in France with a friend, and we were the only English people in there, and everybody was kind of staring at us because they heard us speaking English. But then when they're giving us the menus, and when the guy came to take the order, I speak enough French to be able to order. Well, I should have done it for 8 years, when I was at school. I speak enough French to order it, and after I had ordered in French, they all looked away, and I was okay then. I was okay. I wasn't. They call us roast beef. We call them frog. But yeah, I was okay because I could speak enough French to order them. So, conscious of time, David, is there anything else that you'd like to share that I've not asked you about?
No, I've enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, it's been great. And as always, listeners, there's links to the guests, links to David's website and his socials and his book on the show notes to the episode. Thanks for listening. Thanks to David. I think we've had a deep dive into beliefs and holding them just a little less securely, and as you say, being open. Yeah. Thanks a lot, listeners. We'll speak to you very soon. Cheers. Bye-bye.